The recording device, squiggly lines are appearing, which is good. So Guy, thanks a lot for, talking to me today and participating in the Vital Interests Forum. It's really a pleasure to have you. There's an important election coming up, as we all know. So we'd like to talk about voting in America. But before we get into, contemporary issues, you have done an extensive study of voting in the United States, going way back. So let's do a little history. Getting the franchise in the United States, the right to vote has always been a struggle. Let's not go all the way back to white men with property being the only people that could vote, but let's try to go back to say the the end of the Second World War, the 1950s. And, what happened during that period in terms of, the civil rights struggle and the right to vote.
Yeah, thank you, John. You're exactly right that in this country there has been a very long struggle around what we call the right to vote, although in some respects that's a misnomer. For the most part, the large operating framework of this country has generally been to restrict voting and political participation to a certain group of people. Now, that group has changed historically over time. So as you said, early on in our history, it was largely, although not exclusively, in every colony and then later states, but it was largely propertied white men. And then after the 15th Amendment, we expanded the franchise to black men. Then we had a period for about 15 or so years in which black men exercised the franchise, and then but specifically at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, a lot of states in the South disenfranchised black men, and so the period that you're talking about from the 1950s really is addressing the problem of racial disenfranchisement, using literacy tests, poll taxes, gerrymandering, sometimes violence, and other types of devices as a way of making it hard, if not impossible, for black women and men by the time we get to the 1950s to vote and to exercise the franchise. So we have a long history in which voting discrimination, sometimes on the basis of race, of course on the basis of gender, on the basis of property, on the basis of whether a person has committed a felony or a crime in the past or not, whether the person can read or not, whether the person has paid a certain amount at the polls, right? So there are lots of bases upon which we have historically disenfranchised people in American history, and the 1950s to 1965 civil rights era has dealt with a number of those devices, all centered around race.
Yeah. So can you go into a little bit of the structure of voting in the United States? So, people think that, voting is a federal thing, but really it's a state controlled and arbitrary process. So can you go into, what ramification the state control of voting has had?
Yeah, that's a great question, John. So many Americans take for granted, they assume that they have a federal right to vote, meaning that they think that in the Constitution it provides them explicitly with a right to vote. And unlike most modern constitutions, the American Constitution actually does not provide a specific right to vote. So, in the same way, for example, the First Amendment precludes the government from interfering with a person's speech rights. So the First Amendment provides us with a free speech right or a free press right or a right of assembly. That is not true with respect to voting. There's no constitutional provision that explicitly provides for the right to vote. Now, the Constitution implicitly protects the right to vote for